Welcome to Two Beans in a Pod. Today we're taking a deep dive into some perspectives on Western civilization, and we're going to be looking at excerpts from Douglas Murray's Wikipedia page,
Okay.
and also his book, The War on the West: How to Prevail in the Age of Unreason. So our mission today is to really explore the arguments that are presented in these sources about challenges facing Western societies.
Right.
I think that that's a pretty good summary of what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the first things that jumps out from these sources
Okay.
is this idea that there's this trend of internal criticism
Right.
and sort of undermining of Western traditions and values.
Yeah.
And the book, The War on the West, is really interesting because it sort of frames it as like an examination of attempts to destroy Western civilization from within. And that there's this cultural war being waged against its roots and achievements. Would you say that that's a fair characterization of what you've seen in the book?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a core argument that Murray is making. He's saying that, there's this concerted effort to devalue and dismantle the foundations of Western society, and it's coming from within, which makes it a particularly insidious threat in his view.
Yeah, and one of the things that they highlight is that it's not just like, one particular aspect. Like, it's not just, religious institutions or political ideologies.
Right.
But it seems to be like almost every facet of the Western tradition is under some kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, he talks about everything from the Judeo-Christian foundations to the Enlightenment ideals of secularism and free thought being under attack.
Right.
So it's this really broad critique.
And the interesting thing is, like, they point out that this even extends to things like the concept of free thought and expression, which are themselves criticized as like marks of Western arrogance.
Yeah, it's like this self-defeating argument in a way.
Right.
Because they're using the very principles that they're criticizing to criticize them.
Right.
It's a very interesting paradox.
Yeah, and it's like, for our listeners out there, it really makes you think about like, okay, well, if you're going to critique these things, from what foundation are you building your critique?
Exactly.
And that's kind of what they get into with this concept of critical race theory, or CRT, which the sources describe as originating in universities.
Yeah, it's often associated with academia and legal scholarship. And it really gained traction in the late 20th century.
Okay, and what's the central idea behind CRT?
Well, in a nutshell, it's the idea that race is a fundamental lens through which to understand society and its power dynamics. So it's not just about individual prejudice. It's about looking for systemic racism.
Systemic racism,
which are these kind of hidden mechanisms of racism that they argue perpetuate racial disparities.
And they're saying this is happening even though like overt racism has been decreasing.
That's the argument, yeah.
Okay, so it's like even if people aren't outwardly expressing racist views, there's still this underlying system that's perpetuating inequality.
Exactly.
Okay.
And a key part of this is the emphasis on lived experience.
Okay.
So they prioritize personal narratives and perspectives over traditional evidence, like statistics or historical data.
So it's more about how people feel and experience the world.
Yeah.
Rather than objective measures of inequality.
Exactly.
Okay, I see. And one of the things that kind of flows from this is that it seems like it can lead to a demonization of whiteness and white people in general. And the book uses Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility as an example, where the argument is made that basically all white people are racist. And even denying that you're racist is seen as proof that you are racist.
Yeah, like a catch-22 situation. Where any reaction to being accused of racism is interpreted as further evidence of racism.
Right. And so how do you even have a conversation about that?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's because it creates this kind of logical trap where any attempt to engage in dialogue is kind of shut down by this predetermined conclusion.
And for our listeners, I think it's important to note that we're not saying whether this is right or wrong or true or false.
Exactly.
We're just trying to present the arguments as they're laid out in these sources so that we can understand this perspective.
Right. It's about understanding the line of reasoning.
Right. And how it leads to these conclusions.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving on. The sources also talk about this concept of moral panics.
Interesting.
And they give some specific examples, like the whole thing with the University of Indiana KKK sighting.
Oh, right, where it turned out to be a Dominican monk.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy to see how that could happen.
Right.
But still, it created this huge panic.
Yeah, and then there was that similar thing at the University of Missouri where there was this claim of a KKK presence, and later it came out that it was just misinformation.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then they bring up the Jussie Smollett case. Oh, wow.
Which was a pretty high-profile example.
Yeah, definitely.
Of a fabricated hate crime.
Right.
And it seems like what they're getting at with these examples is that there's this kind of heightened sensitivity around issues of race that can lead to people interpreting events in a very specific way.
Yeah, it's like there's this lens that some people are looking through, and it can distort their perception of reality.
And I think that's a really important point for people to consider. Because, you know, if you're constantly on edge looking for racism everywhere, you're going to find it, whether it's actually there or not.
Yeah, exactly.
And that can create a lot of anxiety and division. So it's about being aware of that potential bias and trying to approach these situations with a more critical and nuanced perspective.
Right, not jumping to conclusions.
Exactly.
And being open to the possibility that things might not always be as they seem.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to be careful about, you know, perpetuating these moral panics.
Because even if your intentions are good, if you're spreading misinformation, it can have a really negative impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's always good to check your sources and make sure that you're not just, you know, reacting emotionally, but that you're actually basing your opinions on solid evidence.
Yeah.
And speaking of popular culture, that's another area where the book kind of dives into this whole idea of this anti-Western sentiment. And they use some interesting examples, like the controversy over the Bachelor contestant.
Oh, right.
Who had attended an antebellum themed party.
Yeah.
And then there was the whole thing with the Jeopardy contestant whose hand gesture was misinterpreted as a white supremacist sign.
I remember that, yeah.
So it seems like even, you know, in the realm of entertainment, people are looking for these signs of racism.
It's inherent.
It's
hyper awareness of anything.
That could be construed as racially insensitive.
Right. And sometimes it feels like things are being taken out of context.
Or blown out of proportion. It's like, you know, maybe this person didn't even realize that. What they were doing could be perceived as offensive.
Right. It might not have been intentional.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to matter sometimes.
And that's kind of a scary thought because it feels like there's no room for error.
Right.
And, you know, it's like you have to be constantly on guard about everything you say and do for fear of offending someone.
Yeah, it can create this chilling effect on free expression, where people are afraid to speak their minds for fear of being labeled as racist.
And I think this also ties into some of the practical consequences that the sources talk about, like the way that this anti-Western sentiment is playing out in schools. And they give some pretty disturbing examples. Like there's this one case where a teacher's employment was contingent on healing relationships with students of color. And then there was this principal who admitted to demonizing white kids. And then there are these examples of curriculum changes in private schools where they're incorporating critical race theory perspectives and removing classic literature. So it's like these ideas are actually having a real impact on how children are being educated. And, you know, it's raising some serious questions about whether this is really beneficial or if it's actually creating more division. And, you know, for our listeners out there who are parents or educators, this is something to really pay attention to because it's affecting the next generation and the way that they're going to view the world.
Exactly.
And it's not just limited to schools. This whole concept of equity over equality is something that the sources bring up as well. And they give examples like Disney's training for employees and the CDC's initial vaccine prioritization recommendation, which included this idea of mitigating health inequities as an ethical principle. So it seems like this focus on equity is leading to some pretty significant changes in various sectors of society. And the book argues that this can actually lead to unequal treatment based on race.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Yeah. Because in striving for equity, you might end up treating people unequally in order to achieve equal outcomes.
And that's where it gets really tricky because it raises all these questions about, you know, fairness and justice. And how do you actually measure whether you're achieving equity without creating new forms of discrimination?
Yeah, it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, and another argument that they make is that this whole focus on Western society's failings when it comes to race isn't really mirrored in the way that we look at other global powers.
Right.
And they use China as a prime example. You know, they talk about the Chinese Communist Party's human rights record and their global influence. And it's like they're demanding that the West introspect on racism, but they're not really engaging in that same level of self-examination themselves.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, it's like this double standard where the West is held to a different standard than other parts of the world.
And it's something that Murray really emphasizes throughout the book.
Right, and he talks about post-colonialism as well.
Yes.
And kind of this tendency to blame Western imperialism for all the problems in former colonies while downplaying internal factors like corruption or mismanagement.
Yeah, he's not denying the negative impacts of colonialism.
Right.
But he's arguing for a more nuanced perspective.
Okay. That takes into account all the factors at play.
Exactly.
And he brings up India as an example of a country that has been successful despite its colonial past.
Right. It's about acknowledging that agency and internal dynamics also play a role in a nation's development.
So it's not just this simplistic narrative of the West being bad and everyone else being good.
Right. It's more complicated than that.
And that kind of leads into this whole discussion about historical reinterpretations. And they bring up the 1619 Project as an example of that, where they're really trying to reframe American history with slavery as the central defining element.
And they link it to capitalism as well.
Yeah, they argue that the origins of capitalism are tied to plantations.
Right.
And it's like, they're saying that this is the foundation of the entire American economic system, which is obviously a very controversial claim.
Yeah, definitely.
And then they talk about the iconoclasm of 2020, where you had all these statues being toppled, like Christopher Columbus, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all these historical figures being torn down. And it's like, there's this effort to erase or reevaluate the past based on modern day sensibilities.
Yeah, and it raises questions about how we should approach history. Yeah. And how we should remember our past.
And for listeners out there, I think it's important to consider the implications of this. Because if we start erasing history or rewriting it, fit our current narratives, what does that mean for the future?
Right, it's a slippery slope. And it's important to have those discussions.
Okay, so moving on. The book also critiques some specific intellectuals, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Edward Said, who they see as promoting anti-Western perspectives. And they mention Sartre's preface to Fanon's work and Said's Orientalism as examples of this.
Yeah, those are definitely influential works that have shaped post-colonial thought.
Right, and they argue that these works are fundamentally critical of Western culture and traditions.
Right, and they see it as a form of intellectual self-hatred, where Western intellectuals are essentially siding with the enemies of the West.
And that's a pretty strong accusation.
Yeah, definitely. But it's part of Murray's overall argument, that there's this internal assault on Western civilization.
Yeah.
And it's coming from within the intellectual elite.
And it's interesting because they do acknowledge that understanding other cultures through one's own lens is kind of inevitable.
Yeah, it's hard to escape your own biases.
Right.
And your own cultural background.
Yeah.
When you're trying to understand something different.
So it's not necessarily sinister.
Right.
But it's something to be aware of and to try to mitigate as much as possible. And they bring up the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at Oxford as an example of this, applying anti-colonial sentiment to Western institutions. And then there's the controversy surrounding Nigel Bager's project on the ethics of the British Empire. So it's like, there's this ongoing debate about how to deal with the legacies of colonialism and imperialism. And, you know, whether it's to judge historical figures
by
today's standards.
And whether it's fair to hold institutions accountable for the actions of their predecessors.
Right. It's a really complicated issue, and there are no easy answers.
And for our listeners out there, it's important to engage in these discussions with an open mind and to try to understand all sides of the argument.
Okay, so another thing they bring up is the history of slavery. And it's interesting because they point out that while Western transatlantic slavery gets a lot of attention, the Arab slave trade, which happened eastward, is often ignored, even though it potentially involved a much larger number of people, and even practices like castration.
Yeah, it's a part of history that's not talked about as much.
Right.
But it's just as horrific.
And I think it's important to acknowledge all forms of slavery and not just focus on one at the expense of others.
Right. It's about having a complete picture of the horrors of this practice.
And it's not to say that one form of slavery is worse than another, but it's just to say that we need to be aware of the full scope of the issue.
Yeah, it's about understanding the complexity of history.
Right, and not trying to simplify it.
Exactly.
So the book also talks about colonialism in a bit more detail, and they argue that it's not just about Western wrongs, but also Western rights. And they give the example of the Indian population rising under British rule as a counterpoint to this claim that there was this deliberate starvation.
Yeah, it's a very controversial topic.
Yeah.
And there are strong arguments on both sides. But Murray is trying to present a more balanced view.
Okay. That acknowledges the complexities of colonialism.
Right.
And he also talks about the continuation of slavery in other parts of the world, even while it was being abolished in the West.
Yeah, that's an important point. Because it shows that this wasn't just a Western problem.
Right.
It was a global phenomenon. And it's important to remember that.
And another interesting thing they bring up is this whole criticism of historical figures like Winston Churchill.
Oh, yeah.
And they argue that a lot of these criticisms are based on selective quotes or misrepresentations of his views. Like, for example, this claim that he advocated gassing Iraqi civilians, which they point out was actually tear gas, not mustard gas. And then there's the whole controversy over his role in the Bengal famine, where the book argues that he actually did send aid. So it's like they're saying that, you know, we need to be careful about judging historical figures based on incomplete information.
Yeah, it's easy to take things out of context.
Right, or to cherry pick quotes to support a particular narrative. And it's important to look at the full picture before we pass judgment.
Right, it's about being fair to history.
Yeah, and to the individuals involved. And then they bring up the UN Durban Conference as an example of a forum where Western democracies were really attacked and blamed for a lot of global issues. And it's interesting because they point out that there was even praise given to figures like Fidel Castro.
Wow.
So it's like there's this kind of anti-Western bias that's present even in these international organizations.
Like the West is always the villain.
Right, and everyone else is the victim. And it's not to say that the West hasn't done bad things, but it's just to say that it's not the only one.
Right, it's about recognizing that every nation has its own history of good and bad.
And then they bring up the whole topic of reparations for slavery in the U.S. And it's like, this is a very controversial issue that's been gaining a lot of traction in recent years. And it raises all these questions about, you know, how do you even calculate what those reparations would look like and who would be eligible to receive them? And it's just a really complex issue that I think we need to have a lot more discussion about before we can even start to talk about solutions.
Yeah, it's not something that can be easily resolved.
And they also talk about this idea of cultural appropriation.
Oh, yeah.
And they give examples, like wearing feathered headdresses or white people wearing dreadlocks.
Right.
And it seems like they're arguing that this concern about cultural appropriation stems from this perceived preference for whiteness.
Interesting.
So it's like certain cultures are seen as off limits to people who aren't part of that culture. And it's like, this creates a lot of division and resentment because it's like you're saying that people can't appreciate or engage with other cultures without being accused of stealing.
It's a very sensitive issue.
And for our listeners out there, if you're interested in learning more about this, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel because we're going to be doing a lot more deep dives into these kinds of topics. Okay, so finally, the book concludes with this kind of overview of the rise of CRT awareness around 2021. And the backlash against it, and they mention General Milley's defense of studying CRT. And then there are these counter-arguments that CRT is just this invented hysteria.
Yeah, it's become a very polarizing topic.
Right, and it's interesting because the conclusion really reiterates this idea
Representative government,
representative government, liberties, civil rights, and the global appeal of Western culture.